It is said that at the beginning of things, Mawu, the creator, traveled with Aidowedo, the great serpent, and that the serpent's movements shaped the land. As it twisted its body, it moved hills and laid riverbeds. Its droppings formed mountains. Mawu made the world like a calabash, one of the large gourds used to make serving bowls. First, she shaped the lower bowl, and then she shaped the sky as the lid. When she had finished, she found the world was sinking from the weight of the hills and the trees and other growth upon the surface. And so she asked Aidowedo to serve as a support, to coil himself at the base of the world and to hold it up. Aidowedo coiled himself up in the same way that women now coil a cloth to put on their heads when they are going to carry a burden, and so stabilize the world. Because Aidowedo is a creature of the cold, Mawu created the sea around the world to keep the serpent cool. This account of how the world came to be comes from the Fon of Benin, formerly Dahomey, a West African country. It is an example of a geomyth. Geomyths are mythological stories which aim to explain the existence or formation of geological features or phenomena. As you can imagine, mythology and folklore from around the world abounds in geomyths and folklore. As you can also imagine, the African continent, being the oldest inhabited landmass on the planet, has some really amazing geomyths and landform folklore. In this episode of the Mythological Africans podcast, we'll define the concept of geomythology, which is another term for the folklore of landforms, and in the process, start our exploration of the kinds of stories African people have come up with to explain the landforms and landscapes of wherever they have found themselves on the continent. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Nde. The term geomythology was coined in 1968 by Dorothy Vitaliano, an American geologist. She defined geomythology as the practice of using myths and legends to explain geological processes and events. Geomythology is also referred to as legends of the earth, landscape mythology, myths of observation, and natural knowledge, and it applies to every effort to study the oral and written traditions created by pre-scientific cultures to explain, often using vivid poetic or mythological imagery, different geological events and phenomena like earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, tsunamis, land formations, which are striking or ordinary, fossils, and natural features of the landscape. In simpler terms, geomythology is the study of how people across the world have used stories to explain the world around them or geological events that they witnessed. I want to emphasize here just how important this is because us modern humans have centuries of scientific knowledge, which we largely take for granted. But pre-scientific humans had to rely on the power of close and careful observation, sometimes over generations, imaginative wordplay, and metaphor to understand their environment and communicate what they understand or remember or witnessed to present and future generations. This sometimes made the difference between life and death, but we'll get to this later. Folklorists and people who study myths have sorted geomyths into two major categories. The first category is etiological or explanatory myths, and these are stories which seek to explain various features of the environment. Etiological or explanatory myths tend to be fantastical and very rarely, unless by coincidence, actually align with the scientific explanation for the geological feature or phenomenon in question. The fawn creation myth, which we read at the beginning of this episode, is an example of an etiological myth. We know that mountains were not formed by Aidowedo's poop. But to the Fon at the times when these myths were being created, none were greater than Mau or Aidowedo, and so that the world was formed by their movements and detritus only served to highlight their greatness. Earthquake folklore from the African continent has some of the funniest and most entertaining geomyths. Take this story from the Busoga of East Africa, who believe that earthquakes are caused by an earthquake god called Kitaba, who shakes the earth if he walks too fast. Another geomyth recorded in the folklore of the Wanyamwezi of Tanzania, and this aims to explain earthquakes, states that the earth is a disk, and one end of the disk is supported by a mountain, and the other end is held up by a giant. The giant's wife holds up the sky. And so when the giant reaches out to embrace his wife, the earth trembles. I find this myth fascinating for two reasons. First, what a sweet love story. But also, if we take the imaginative leap to picture the giant as a tectonic plate, the story starts to sound a bit closer to a scientific explanation for earthquakes. Another example of this would be the story of the Virunga volcanoes of North Kivu province in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Nyiragongo, one of the peaks, is an active volcano which erupted as recently as 2021. According to the legends, however, for a long time, a powerful spirit called Ryangombe, or the Ox Eater, battled his arch nemesis, another spirit called Nyiragongo, and each battle caused an eruption from one of the peaks in the Virunga mountain range. Nyiragongo originally lived in a peak called Mikeno, but in one battle, Ryangombe split Mikeno into two, and so Nyiragongo fled westward to the peak that bears his name today. But Ryangombe cut off the top of that peak and pushed Nyiragongo into it and then piled hot stones on top of him to keep him down. As some of you may know, Mount Nyiragongo is currently the location of one of the world's most voluminous lava lakes. What is great about this geomyth is that in addition to being etiological, so explanatory, it also is historical, and that is the second kind of geomyth. Historical geomyths record actual historical events, albeit using the language of myth and folklore, so geological events that were witnessed and recorded in oral traditions. And in the case of the Virunga volcanoes, the statement about Ryangombe and Nyiragongo's flight from Mikeno and the present existence of the lava alludes to the history of eruptions in the Virunga range. What's interesting is that the geomorphology of the Virunga Mountains, and that is the way that the documented way that they have changed over time, confirms that the Mikeno Peak, now dormant, was once an active volcano. Its activity stopped after Ryangombe, according to the myth, forced Nyiragongo out of Mikeno. This myth also confirms that Visoke, Karisimbi, Muhavura, Sabanyino, and Gahinga, and these are other peaks in the range, were also once active. That is, at the other times the two great spirits fought and their fights erupted as the mountain. And these myths also offer the understanding that the Nyiragongo peak used to be inactive and also became an active volcano after Ryangombe pushed Nyiragongo into the peak. The lava lake can be explained by the hot stones which Ryangombe piled on Nyiragongo to keep him down. Whether they are explanatory or historical, geomyths offer important insight on how people relate to their environment and think about relationships. For example, the idea that two powerful spirits are in battle or competition with each other is probably just a reflection of what people witnessed in their daily lives. However, in the folk beliefs of the people who live around Mount Nyiragongo, calm and benevolent land spirits now live in Ryangombe's realm, while hostile spirits live in and around Mount Nyiragongo. In the past, such beliefs more than likely would have prevented people from settling around Nyiragongo, which would have kept them safe from harm. As it stands, the city of Goma, with about 1.2 million people, is located just a couple of kilometers or miles away from Nyiragongo. We'll stop here for the week, but don't stray too far away. We'll be back next week with more landform folklore or geomythology from the African continent.